June 19, 1944, over the Philippine Sea. The cockpit of the Mitsubishi A6M0 vibrated with the strain of altitude. Ensign Hiroshi Takamura gripped the stick, sweat pooling beneath his flight goggles. Below him, the blue expanse of the Philippine Sea burned with fire. American Hellcats and Avengers darted through the chaos like steel hornets. "Bandit, 3 o'clock, his radio crackled. Too late. Tracers ripped past, slamming into the Zero's fuselage. Takamura banked hard, watching smoke rise from another Japanese carrier. It was the Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 19th, 1944. The day Japan's air power was gutted. More than 300 planes would fall in what pilots would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But while men like Takamura fought for survival in the skies, another battle was unfolding far away, a silent struggle of logistics, range, and geography. The United States had found the key to striking Japan itself, the Mariana Islands. To Japan's Imperial High Command in Tokyo, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were little more than dots in the Western Pacific, remote, unimportant. But to the planners in Washington and the engineers at Boeing, those same dots were the launch pads of apocalypse. The Americans had a new weapon, one unlike anything the world had seen. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress. With a range of 3,000 miles, pressurized cabins, and the ability to fly at altitudes unreachable by most fighters, it was built for one purpose: to take the war to Japan's doorstep. And now, with the U.S. Navy smashing through the Central Pacific, the time had come to claim the islands that could bring Tokyo within reach. As the sun set on that bloody June day, a Japanese signal officer aboard the carrier Zuikaku tried to patch through a message to Tokyo. "Enemy air power overwhelming. Our losses catastrophic." The transmission cut short as another wave of American dive bombers descended. Miles away, Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the USS Indianapolis watched the horizon glow orange. "We're breaking their spine," he said quietly to his staff. "Next stop, Saipan." The road to Japan had just opened, and Japan didn't even realize it yet. June 15th, 1944, the invasion of Saipan. The horizon burned with dawn as thousands of American Marines gripped the sides of their Higgins boats. Ahead of them, the volcanic island of Saipan loomed. Jagged cliffs, dense jungle, and hidden machine gun nests. At 7 true hours, naval guns from battleships Tennessee, California, and Maryland thundered in unison, shaking the sea. Shells slammed into Japanese fortifications, ripping the coral ridges apart. The Marines could feel the concussion even from miles offshore, each blast like the heartbeat of an awakening giant. 30 seconds, a coxswain shouted. The ramp dropped, and the world erupted into chaos. Machine gun tracers cut through the surf. Men fell before they even reached the sand, but wave after wave of Marines pressed forward. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions clawing their way up the beaches near Charankanoa. On a hill overlooking the invasion, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, commander of Saipan's garrison, raised his binoculars. His face tightened. Smoke choked the air. An American landing craft stretched to the horizon. "How many?" he muttered to his staff officer. "Perhaps 30,000, the man whispered. Saito shook his head. "No, more." By nightfall, over 20,000 Marines had landed. Behind them, tanks and artillery rolled ashore. Offshore, Admiral Richmond Turner's amphibious fleet maintained constant fire, a relentless storm of steel. Tokyo received the first reports that evening. The Imperial General Headquarters dismissed them at first. Saipan? Surely the Americans wouldn't waste resources there. But when additional messages came, panic stirred in the corridors of the Daihone. The Marianas were supposed to be a distant buffer, thousands of miles from Japan's home islands. But if the Americans captured Saipan, their long-range bombers could reach Tokyo. A staff officer calculated the range and brought it to General Anami Korechika, Vice Minister of War. From Saipan to Tokyo 1,500 miles, sir. Anami frowned. Impossible. They would need a plane the size of a battleship. He didn't yet know that such a machine already existed, its name whispered among American pilots as something mythical. The B-29 Superfortress. Back on Saipan, the Japanese defenders dug in for what they called the decisive battle for the homeland. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off. But orders were clear. Fight to the death. For the Marines, every yard was bought with blood. By June 20th, the fields around Garapan were littered with wrecked Japanese tanks and smoldering palm trees. The stench of death mixed with the sweetness of tropical air. At night, the sound of waves mingled with the distant cries of civilians hiding in caves. Saipan wasn't just a military target. It was part of Japan's civilian frontier, populated by settlers who now faced annihilation. And still, the Americans pushed on. They knew that if Saipan fell, Japan's inner defenses would be breached, and the sky over Tokyo would soon burn. The fall of Saipan, Japan's darkest realization. July 6, 1944. Dawn broke over the shattered ridges of Mount Taposhao. Smoke rose like ghosts from the jungle below. American Marines, gaunt, mud-streaked, and hollow-eyed, crouched in foxholes as the distant sound of a bugle echoed through the mist. Then came the scream. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, the remnants of General Saito's once proud garrison, charged through the haze in a final desperate banzai assault. Many carried no rifles, only bayonets tied to sticks or grenades clutched in both hands. Captain Fred O'Brien of the 105th Infantry watched in disbelief. "They're coming in waves," he shouted into the radio. "Thousands." The line buckled. For 3 hours, the Americans fought at point-blank range, bayonets, pistols, and fists. Tanks fired at near-zero elevation. When it was over, the field was carpeted with bodies. Over 3,000 Japanese dead. And with that, Saipan was finished. General Saito, wounded and barely able to stand, gathered his remaining staff in a cave overlooking the sea. He bowed stiffly. "The battle is lost. For the Emperor, we die with honor." Minutes later, he drew his sword, and a single pistol shot echoed across the cliffs. But the horror wasn't over. Civilians, hundreds of them, emerged from hiding. American loudspeakers blared pleas in Japanese. "Do not jump! We will not harm you!" Yet many, taught that capture meant torture, threw themselves from the cliffs of Marpi Point into the sea below. The cliffs would later be named Banzai Cliff and Suicide Cliff, monuments to a nation's indoctrinated despair. When news reached Tokyo, the reaction was immediate and devastating. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo convened an emergency meeting at the Imperial Palace. The room was silent as an aide read the telegram. Saipan lost, enemy in full control. For the first time, Emperor Hirohito broke decorum and asked a direct question. "Then the war cannot be won." Tojo, pale and trembling, could not answer. Within days, his cabinet resigned. The fall of Saipan wasn't just a military loss, it was a psychological collapse. Japan's last outer defense had crumbled, and in Washington, the victory electrified planners at the 20th Air Force. Now, for the first time, the range tables on the B-29 blueprints had a real-world application. General Henry Hap Arnold stood before a wall-sized map of the Pacific in the Pentagon's War Room. His finger traced the arc from Saipan to Tokyo, 1,500 miles exactly. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "the Superfortress can make that run." From airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, soon to be carved out of jungle and coral by the U.S. Navy's Seabees, the B-29 would bring fire to the heart of Japan. The Japanese High Command didn't believe it. Not yet. They thought it was a bluff, an exaggeration of American propaganda. The idea that an aircraft could fly 3,000 miles round trip, carry 10 tons of bombs, and return home safely. Unthinkable. But by the time they realized it was real, Tokyo's skies would already be burning. forging the airfields, the Seabees, and the birth of a superfortress base. August 1944. The roar of bulldozers echoed across the coral plains of Tinian. Waves crashed against the island's western cliffs, carrying the smell of diesel, mud, and war. Thousands of Navy Seabees, construction battalions forged from steelworkers, farmers, and miners, worked around the clock beneath a punishing tropical sun. Men in sweat-soaked uniforms shouted over the growl of engines. Diesel fumes mingled with a thick scent of pulverized coral. Bulldozers leveled jungle, graders scraped runways into existence, and cranes lifted steel frames for hangars taller than cathedrals. Commander Robert M. Thompson of the Seabees' 71st Battalion surveyed the work from a jeep, his clipboard streaked with rain. "We're not building a base," he muttered. "We're building a city, one that flies." By September, the scale of construction was staggering. On Tinian alone, 4 parallel runways, each over 8,000 feet long, began to take shape, stretching across the island's flat limestone plateau. The engineers had selected it precisely for this reason. It was large, level, and defensible, perfect for the B-29 Superfortress. Each runway was a monument to American logistical might. Fuel pipelines snaked across the island. Warehouses sprouted like mushrooms. Bomb storage pits, maintenance hangars, and tent cities sprawled over the coral fields. The Seabees joked that Tinian had become Kansas with palm trees. And they weren't far off. By October, barracks, mess halls, and even makeshift movie theaters stood where only jungle had existed 3 months earlier. It was an engineering miracle, accomplished under the threat of sniper fire and tropical disease. Half a world away, in Tokyo, the Imperial Army's intelligence section began receiving vague reports. Reconnaissance submarines had glimpsed massive American construction on Saipan and Tinian, but details were scarce. Colonel Hideo Iwakuro studied one such report by candlelight. "Airfields for large bombers," it read, "possibly for aircraft of unusual range." He scoffed. Impossible. No plane could fly from there to Japan and return. But in Washington, General Hap Arnold smiled grimly. The 20th Air Force had a name for its new headquarters, the Marianas. From this string of islands, America could finally unleash the machine it had built for this very purpose. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, 4 Wright R-3350 engines, 3,700-mile maximum range, 8,000-pound bomb load. Capable of flying higher than 30,000 feet, beyond the reach of most Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns. At a test field in Kansas, crews practiced navigation and gunnery for the Pacific Run. Pilots learned to manage the complex pressurization systems, while gunners tested the new central fire control, a computer-assisted remote turret system that could track and engage multiple targets simultaneously. They were preparing for the longest bombing campaign in history, a direct strike at the Japanese homeland. By November, the first superfortresses began arriving at Saipan and Guam, gleaming in the sunlight. The island's coral dust coated their silver skins, earning them the nickname Ghost Ships. One pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Rosie Rosenthal, wrote home, "You can stand at the end of the runway and see nothing but silver giants lined up, engines turning. It feels like we've built a hammer the size of the Pacific itself." The hammer was ready. The anvil awaited. Japan. December 1944. The Superfortress takes flight. December 17th, 1944. The dawn over Saipan was blood red. Rows of B-29 Superfortresses stood poised on the coral runways, wings shimmering in the rising sun, engines coughing to life one by one. Ground crews moved like clockwork beneath them, fueling hoses, bomb carts, and final checks. The mission was codenamed San Antonio War, the first major strike on Tokyo launched from the Mariana Islands. For the men of the 20th Air Force, it was the culmination of a dream and a gamble. At 4:30, Colonel Clifford Heflin climbed into the cockpit of Dauntless Dottie, the lead aircraft of the 73rd Bomb Wing. He strapped in, checked his gauges, and gave a thumbs up to his co-pilot. Let's show them what 3,000 miles looks like. The engines roared. 4 2,200 horsepower Wright Cyclones pulling the giant aircraft forward. The runway trembled under the weight. One by one, the B-29s took off, their landing lights winking out over the sea, forming a glittering chain of silver dots stretching north into the night. Each plane carried up to 7 tons of bombs and 2,000 gallons of fuel, enough to reach Tokyo, drop their loads, and barely make it home. The flight would take 14 hours round trip through hostile skies and unpredictable winds. As they climbed past 25,000 feet, ice crystals formed along the windows. The air thinned. Inside the pressurized cabin, gunners checked their remote-controlled turrets, adjusting the analog sighting computers that linked them. At 10:45, Tokyo appeared through breaks in the cloud, a sprawling maze of gray rooftops and smokestacks. Below, anti-aircraft guns opened fire, peppering the sky with black bursts. Major Jack B. Bunting, flying in Ramp Tramp, called out over the intercom. Flak at 11 o'clock. Heavy but inaccurate. Hold steady. Bomb bay doors opened. The bombs, clusters of high-explosive M64s, fell away, their fins spinning. Moments later, they tore through industrial blocks in Tokyo's Musashino district, shattering factories that produced engine parts for Japanese fighters. From his office in the city, a stunned Japanese engineer looked skyward as the air raid sirens wailed. He could barely see the aircraft, tiny silver dots above the clouds. Impossible, he thought. Nothing can fly that far. Back at the Imperial General Headquarters, confusion reigned. Reports flooded in. Enemy bombers over Tokyo, aircraft type unknown, altitude 30,000 feet. Admiral Toyoda Suemu, chief of the combined fleet, slammed his fist on the table. From where? The air staff hesitated. One officer finally murmured, "We believe from the Marianas." Toyoda's eyes narrowed. The Marianas, but that's over 1,500 miles away. Another whispered, "Sir, the Americans must have a new type of aircraft." Silence filled the war room. For the first time, Japan's high command grasped what had happened. The United States had created a bomber capable of bridging the Pacific. When Dauntless Dottie landed back on Saipan 14 hours later, her crew staggered out, exhausted but triumphant. The mission had proven the concept. Japan was no longer untouchable. The base commander greeted Heflin on the tarmac. "How was Tokyo?" Heflin removed his flight cap and looked toward the horizon. "Closer than I ever thought it'd be." From that day forward, the war in the Pacific entered its final, terrible phase, a campaign of fire and ash that would bring Japan's cities to their knees. And the generals in Tokyo, still reeling from disbelief, could only stare at their maps and wonder how an island they'd once ignored had become their undoing. The realization. Japan faces the unthinkable. January 1945. Tokyo, a city blanketed by frost, its streets eerily quiet beneath the weight of fear. Air raid sirens had become part of the city's daily rhythm, yet most citizens believed the bombings would cease. Surely the enemy couldn't sustain such attacks from so far away. But inside the underground chambers of the Imperial General Headquarters in Ichigaya, disbelief was giving way to dread. Maps of the Pacific sprawled across polished oak tables. The red pins marking American positions had crept ever closer, from the Gilberts to the Marshalls to the Marianas. Now, 3 small islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, formed a triangle of death aimed straight at Japan's heart. General Anami Korechika stood before the map, his finger tracing the arc between Tokyo and the Marianas. 1,500 miles, he muttered. And yet, they come. Again and again. His intelligence chief, Colonel Hattori Takushiro, adjusted his glasses nervously. "Sir, our radar stations on Kyushu and the Bonins have confirmed multiple inbound raids. Same altitude, same approach vector. These are not carrier aircraft." Anami turned slowly. "Then what are they?" Hattori hesitated. "The Americans call them B-29s. Superfortress. 4 engines. Enormous range." We did not think such machines possible." The room fell silent. The men of the Imperial Army, once masters of the Pacific, were now facing a weapon that rewrote the laws of war. Meanwhile, in the skies over the Bonin Islands, a formation of 73 B-29s cut north through the cold stratosphere, contrails weaving silver threads behind them. Inside city of Galveston, Navigator Lieutenant Richard Hobbs peered through his sextant. "Fix complete," he said. "Tokyo in 90 minutes. Below, the Pacific shimmered like liquid glass. For hours there was nothing but wind, engine noise, and the hiss of oxygen masks. The B-29's pressurized cabin made it eerily quiet, like flying inside a submarine suspended in the heavens. Captain Raymond Schultz checked his instruments, the altimeter steady at 29,000 feet. "This thing flies like a cathedral," he muttered. "And today we're ringing the bells." At 10:10 a.m., Tokyo appeared again, gray and sprawling beneath scattered clouds. This time, their target was the Nakajima Aircraft Engine Works, one of Japan's last major aircraft factories. Anti-aircraft guns fired desperately, black bursts rising through the sky, but the B-29s were too high. The bombs fell true, tearing through the factory complex and shattering assembly lines below. In the city, people ran through the streets as the explosions echoed like rolling thunder. The Imperial Palace itself shook with the force of distant detonations. An aide rushed into General Umezu Yoshijiro's office. "Sir, Tokyo is being bombed again, over 100 aircraft." Umezu stood in stunned silence. "From where?" he demanded, though he already knew the answer. When the reports came that the bombers had returned southward, not toward China, but toward the open ocean, the realization hit like a hammer. The enemy had found a base in the Marianas large enough to sustain such strikes. The Japanese Navy dispatched reconnaissance submarines to confirm it, but only one returned, with grainy photos showing massive airfields carved into the coral. Hundreds of bombers, each larger than any in Japan's arsenal, were lined up wingtip to wingtip. The images were shown to Emperor Hirohito himself. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then softly, he murmured, "We once called them the Islands of the Dead, but now they have become the Islands of Destruction." The impossible had become reality. The American B-29s could now reach any city in Japan, at will, and the generals knew. This was no longer a war of soldiers and fleets. It was a war of endurance, of fire, air, and will. March 9th, 1945. Fire over Tokyo. Night fell over Tokyo like a curtain of ash. The sky was low, heavy, and warm. A rare southern wind pushing in from the bay. Beneath it, more than 8 million people slept among wooden houses packed shoulder to shoulder. At 10:30 p.m., air raid sirens began to wail. Few took them seriously anymore. The city had endured months of B-29 raids with minimal damage. People believed the bombers couldn't see through the cloud cover, that the gods were protecting them. But tonight, the gods were silent. Far to the south, over the dark Pacific, 334 B-29 Superfortresses roared northward from the Marianas. Their bellies were loaded not with high explosives, but with something far deadlier, clusters of M69 napalm incendiary bombs. On Tinian, just hours before takeoff, General Curtis LeMay had briefed his crews bluntly. "You're going in low," he said. 5,000 to 7,000 feet, no formation flying, no oxygen masks. You're going to burn the industrial heart of Tokyo to the ground." A nervous murmur rippled through the briefing room. Flying low meant exposure to anti-aircraft fire. But LeMay didn't flinch. "This is war," he barked, "and tonight we're going to shorten it." The first wave crossed the Japanese coast just after midnight. Radar stations on Chiba detected them. Too many to count. "Enemy aircraft approaching in large numbers," the operators reported. Altitude low, very low. At 12:08 a.m., the lead bomber, General Arnold's command, flown by Colonel Thomas S. Power, reached the target zone. The bombardier toggled the release. Clusters of small cylinders tumbled through the clouds, 500,000 in total across the formation. They burst open mid-air, scattering flaming gelatin that stuck to everything it touched. Within minutes, the eastern wards of Tokyo were ablaze. Firestorms merged, feeding on oxygen. Wooden homes erupted like torches. The heat grew so intense that asphalt liquefied, rivers boiled, and wind gusts turned into 100-mile-per-hour fire vortices. In the cockpit of Lucky 11, Captain Paul Tibbets watched the inferno spread. "God Almighty," he whispered. "It's a whole city on fire." Below, civilians fled through streets that had become rivers of flame. Firemen collapsed in the heat, mothers clutched children and leapt into canals, which soon filled with the dead. By dawn, 16 square miles of Tokyo had vanished. 100,000 people killed in a single night. It was the deadliest air raid in human history. On Tinian, when the first bombers returned, their wings were scorched from the updrafts. Crewmen stepped out in stunned silence. One radio operator murmured, "I never thought I'd smell smoke at 30,000 feet." In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters was in chaos. Communication lines had melted. Districts ceased to exist. When the casualty estimates arrived, General Umezu ordered them sealed from the public. At a press conference the next day, the official statement read only, "An air raid occurred last night. Some damage was sustained." But the truth spread faster than censorship could contain it. The capital had burned. When Emperor Hirohito toured the ruins days later, he wept openly for the first time in his reign. "This," he said quietly, "is the smell of our defeat." The B-29s had done the impossible. From islands Japan once deemed worthless, they had reached across the Pacific and incinerated its proudest city. And it would not stop with Tokyo. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, all would soon follow, one by one, into the fire. Above the blackened ruins, Japan's sky belonged not to its Zero fighters, but to the silver ghosts from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. The Superfortress had turned the Pacific Ocean into a runway of vengeance. The relentless storm, the summer of fire. April 1945. The air above Japan shimmered with smoke. Every night, the rumble of distant engines haunted the cities, a sound like approaching thunder that never brought rain. From Tokyo to Kobe, the people learned to read the skies, to watch for the moonlight that meant the bombers could see them. In the ruins of Asakusa, families dug shelters into the blackened soil, their faces streaked with soot. A mother whispered to her son, "Stay low, stay quiet. The dragons will come again tonight." The dragons were B-29s, hundreds of them, and their fire came not from myth, but from napalm. From his headquarters on Guam, General Curtis LeMay directed the campaign with machine-like precision. He no longer targeted military factories alone. He targeted production, the workshops, the workers, the wooden neighborhoods that kept Japan's war machine alive. Every piece of steel in their tanks, every shell they fire, comes from these homes, he told his staff. We burn the homes, we break the war. And burn they did. On March 16th, Nagoya. On March 19th, Kobe. On March 25th, Osaka. Each raid consumed miles of cityscape, entire neighborhoods erased in hours. At dawn, reconnaissance photos returned to Guam, gray blotches where streets once were. Analysts circled them in red grease pencil and labeled them saturated. It was a word that meant no longer exists. By mid-April, the firebombing campaign had destroyed more than 60 cities. Millions were homeless, yet the B-29 crews, many barely in their 20s, rarely saw the horror firsthand. To them, it was all coordinates and altitude, flashes beneath cloud cover, smoke columns in the distance. Lieutenant John Kessler of the 19th Bomb Group wrote in his diary, "You can see the reflection of the fires on the ocean 100 miles out. It's like flying toward hell, and back again." Inside Japan, despair gave way to fatalism. Air defense units were overwhelmed, fuel and planes were scarce. Even the mighty Zero was powerless at 30,000 feet. Civilians carried bamboo spears, told to fight the invasion that everyone knew was coming. Yet, not all in Japan accepted defeat. Deep within the bunkers beneath the imperial palace, military leaders spoke of decisive battle. They still clung to the hope that American casualties would force a negotiated peace. But on May 25, 1945, that illusion burned with Tokyo once more. In one of the war's largest raids, 464 B-29s struck the capital again, this time in broad daylight. Columns of fire climbed into the sky, the roar audible across the bay. General Umezu stared from a bunker entrance as the skyline vanished behind smoke. "This," he said hoarsely, "is not war. This is annihilation." In Washington, President Harry S. Truman, newly sworn in after Roosevelt's death, received daily briefings from LeMay's command. Japan's infrastructure was collapsing, but its military showed no sign of surrender. The Joint Chiefs began to whisper about a new weapon, something born from the desert laboratories of New Mexico, something that could end the war in one blow. But before that day came, the B-29s would continue their grim duty, one city after another. By July 1945, Japan's skies belonged entirely to America. The once proud Imperial Air Force could muster only scattered resistance. Pilots took off, knowing they wouldn't return. Civilians watched as American bombers flew overhead in daylight, unchallenged. On Tinian, the great airfields pulsed with activity day and night. Mechanics swarmed over rows of B-29s, painting new mission markers. Flames, skulls, and rising suns crossed out in red. Air crews lounged in mess tents, exhausted but resolute, counting down the days to their next sortie. Among them, a new unit began to arrive under tight security. Their planes bore no names, their crews no insignia, only a single phrase on the manifest: Project Silverplate. Something new was coming, something even the B-29 veterans didn't understand. The war had already turned Japan into an inferno. But soon, the fire would become a sun. August 6, 1945. The sun falls on Hiroshima, Tinian Island, 02:45 a.m. Under the pale wash of a full moon, the great silver shape of a B-29 sat waiting at the end of Northfield's runway Able. Its name was stenciled neatly beneath the cockpit window: Enola Gay. Colonel Paul W. Tibbets stood beside it, helmet in hand, his breath fogging in the humid air. Around him, the men of the 509th Composite Group moved in silence, a ritual, precision born from secrecy. The mission briefing had been brief, the orders clear. Their payload was called Little Boy, the rest was classified. Tibbets turned to his co-pilot, Major Robert Lewis. "Let's get her in the air," he said simply. At 2:58, Enola Gay thundered down the coral runway, its 4 Wright Cyclone engines howling in unison. The bomber lifted smoothly into the night, joined by 2 observation aircraft, the Great Artiste and Necessary Evil. Below them, the island that had become the beating heart of the Pacific War fell away into darkness. As they climbed toward cruising altitude, navigator Theodore Dutch Van Kirk traced their course on the chart. North-northwest, past Iwo Jima, toward Honshu. The flight would take 6 hours. Inside the bomb bay, a single weapon hung from a cradle. 10,000 pounds of uranium-235, armed mid-air by a technician named Parsons as the plane approached target range. At dawn, the coast of Japan appeared, a gray outline beneath a clear blue sky. At 08:09 a.m., the radar operator confirmed, "Target in sight, city of Hiroshima ahead." From 31,000 feet, the city looked almost peaceful. Tram cars moved along the streets. Fishermen paddled near the river. Smoke curled gently from factory chimneys. Tibbets steadied the bomber. "Bomb away," he ordered. At 08:15 a.m., Bombardier Major Thomas Ferriby toggled the switch. Little Boy fell free, a black speck spinning toward the city below. 43 seconds later, the world changed. A white flash brighter than the sun filled the sky. A sphere of fire bloomed over the city, expanding in silence before sound caught up. A rolling thunder that shattered windows 50 miles away. The shock wave crushed buildings, vaporized steel, and turned 70,000 people into ash within seconds. From the air, the crew watched in stunned silence. "My God," whispered Lewis, scribbling in his log. "What have we done?" In Tokyo, communication lines went dead. Radio signals from Hiroshima ceased entirely. The Imperial General Headquarters was baffled. Reports were contradictory. City destroyed by single bomb. How could one bomb destroy a city? Hours later, American broadcasts announced it plainly. A single atomic bomb has been dropped on Hiroshima. Admiral Toyota stared at the translation, lips trembling. Atomic? Impossible. They would need the power of the sun. He didn't know how close he was to the truth. The Japanese scientists of the Imperial Navy's Research Bureau scrambled to analyze the data. Radiation readings, magnetic anomalies, and a heat signature that defied comprehension. It all pointed to something beyond conventional physics. And the Americans weren't finished. 3 days later, on August 9th, another B-29, boxcar, left Tinian, bound for Kokura, then Nagasaki. Another flash, another city gone. By mid-August, Japan's empire lay in ruins. Its cities burned, its people starved, and now even the heavens had turned against it. In the Imperial Palace bunker, Emperor Hirohito listened to his advisors argue, some demanding surrender, others insisting on one final stand. Finally, he rose and spoke softly. "If we continue to fight, our nation will be reduced to ashes. I cannot bear to see my people suffer any longer." On August 15th, 1945, Japan surrendered unconditionally. The war that began with fire at Pearl Harbor ended with fire in Hiroshima. And at its center was the machine that made it possible, the B-29 Superfortress, born from the runways of forgotten islands. For the Japanese commanders, who once dismissed Saipan, Tinian, and Guam as insignificant, the revelation came too late. Those islands, those specks on a map, had rewritten the course of history. The empire had fallen, not to invasion, but to the reach of a weapon they never believed could exist. From the Marianas, across 3,000 miles of ocean, the sky had carried their undoing.